talk about pseudo elements, which are a nice little CSS feature that is worth learning about. So pseudo elements are essentially elements that don't exist in the HTML, but that we can still select and style in CSS. And some common examples of that are the first letter of a paragraph or the first line of a paragraph, or of some other text, of course. So let's start with that first example that I gave you of the first letter. So what we can do using a first letter pseudo element is to select the very first letter of this H1 here, which would be this emoji, and then we could format it differently. And so with that, we could fix the fact that this is also italic, which doesn't make a lot of sense. So in the end, it's going to look like this. So no longer italic, and even with some space there on the right side. So let's see how that is going to work. So let's come somewhere down here. And then let's say H1. So we are selecting H1, and then the pseudo element is written using 2 colons. So colon, colon, and then first letter. All right. So pseudo classes are written with just 1 colon, and the pseudo elements are with 2 colons. And so with that, we can easily distinguish between pseudo elements and pseudo classes. So let's style that very first letter. And let's say font style should be not italic, but normal. And let's also give it some margin to the right of 5 pixels. And there you go. Do you see that? Now there's some space and the text is no longer italic. Great. And of course, that would also have worked with any other of the headings and with any other letter. So of course, it doesn't just work with emojis. So let's say we wanted the first letter here of the H2 to be a lot bigger. Let's say font size 60 pixels, for example, or to make it even more visible, 80 pixels, and there you go. So basically, we selected this pseudo element, which again is not actually an element in the HTML, but it is as if it was an element that we can select and then style right here. Okay, but this one here is not that interesting. So let's remove it and let's try another one, which is first line. For example, let's try to select all the paragraphs and then in there select and style the very first line. Let's say we actually want the color to be red, just as a demo. And so you see that actually worked just fine. So this is a paragraph and it is the first line, so it's red. The same here, and here, and really everywhere. Right? Now let me actually show you another new selector that you don't know yet, which is the adjacent element selector or the adjacent sibling selector. So a sibling element is basically an element that is part of the same parent. So for example here, this P is a sibling of this one, and of this one, and of this one, and all these other ones, because they are all inside of the same container, which is in this case, this article, right? Now, the adjacent sibling is a sibling that is actually the very next element. So, for example, the adjacent sibling of this H3 is this paragraph here. Okay, so basically the adjacent element is the sibling that comes right after it. And there's actually a selector for that. So what I want to do is to only select the paragraphs that come after the H3s. So that's going to be this one and this one. Okay, so let's say H3 and then plus. So the plus here is the adjacent sibling selector. So if we save that now, then you see that in fact only the paragraphs that are immediately after the H3, so this one and this one, have been selected. And then in there, of course, only the first line has actually been selected and styled. Okay? But let's actually turn this off. It's not that helpful, but I still want to give you the reference here of first line and maybe even more importantly, of the adjacent sibling selector, which in some cases is actually quite important. All right, but now let's actually use the probably most used and most important pseudo element, which are the after and the before pseudo elements. So the after pseudo element creates a pseudo element that will automatically be the very first child of the selected element. And I'm sure that that sounds quite strange, but this can actually be very useful for some small cosmetic style for which we don't want to necessarily add a new element to the HTML. So let me show you what I mean by that. And it's easiest to show you in the demo. So what I'm talking about is this yellow small thing here. Let's give us some more space so we can actually see it. So essentially I'm adding this small cosmetic style here. So simply saying that this is a top article. All right. And so for this very small, let's say thing, we don't need to add a whole new element into our HTML. I mean, of course we could do that, but this is a good use case to show you the before or the after pseudo elements. All right. Let's put it back and go back here. And so, yeah, so remember that this element here is close to this H1 here. And so what we will do is to create the after pseudo element basically after the H1. So I will just write the code and then it will be a bit easier to understand. So colon, colon, and then after. And now the first property that is mandatory to specify here is the content property. So we specify content, and then here we need to write something. And it can actually just be an empty string, so just this empty text like this. But in this case, we want top. Okay? But even if you don't want any text in your pseudo elements, you still have to define the content property. And actually, at this point, this pseudo element should already be visible in our page. So let's give it a try. And it looks like it's not there yet. But let's figure out right here. Oh, and actually, it is here. You see that? It's here in the H1. So we want it in the H2, actually. And there it is. So there is this element that we just created, and we will style it in a little bit, because like this, it doesn't make a lot of sense. But here you can actually see it even in the DevTools, and as you hover it, it is right there. Okay, but let's now style it a little bit further. Let's give it some background color. I'm going to use some nice yellow with this code here, FFE70E. All right. And so now this looks more like a real element. Then we can also change the font size. For example, we can make it bold. So let's see. And that looks a little bit nicer already. And now let's give it some padding. Now, by default, any pseudo element is actually an inline element. And so if we want to give it any padding, we want the box model to apply to it normally, right? And so in order to do that, we need to render this element as an inline block box. So display inline block. And so this is actually one of the great use cases of using inline block. And so take note of that maybe. Now let's add some padding here. Let's say 5 pixels to the top and 10 pixels to the sides. Nice. So that's already looking quite good. But now we need to add the final piece of the puzzle, which is to actually position it in a meaningful place. So notice how right here the element is like kind of at the end of the element. So at the end, and half of the element is outside of it. So, well, here in our example, let's give our H2 just temporarily a background color here, so we can see what's happening. So background color orange. Okay, and so now where we want this pseudo element to be located is here a bit outside. So first let's put it here in this corner, and then from that we will move it outside. So how do you think we can achieve that? Well, the answer to that is absolute positioning. All right. So the first thing that we need to do in order to absolutely position an element is to first give the parent element inside of which we want actually the positioning to happen, the position relative. Remember that? And so in this case, that's going to be this H2 element. So position relative. And now we are ready to absolutely position this element. So position absolute. And let's put it at the top. And just to test it for now, let's put it on the left. So this will be the top left corner. And indeed, that worked beautifully. It's right here. Just notice what happened if we turned off the position relative here in the H2. Then this would immediately move up here to the very top of the page. Right? And so that's why we can never forget position relative on the parent element inside of which we want this to happen. But now we want it here at the right side. So right here. And now let's actually move it out a little bit. So move it up and move it to the right. Okay, and the reason why I'm doing that is so that I can show you something that we haven't also talked about yet, which is negative length. So if we specify it here 25 pixels to the right, it would move from the right here in this direction to the left, basically. Right? So 25 pixels from the right into this direction. However, if we set a negative value, it will move in the opposite direction. And so now it is right here. So outside of the H1. Well, at least partially. Right? So not the H1, but the H2, of course. Then at the top, let's do the same. Let's say minus 10 pixels. And it could be even a bit more, I guess. Let's say minus 15. And so that looks a bit better. Okay. And so now we can get actually rid of this one here. And there we go. So that looks just like this one, right? Well, it's a bit different. This one is a bit more up, so we can move it back down, let's say 10. And also the color is black. So let's do that here. And let's stay consistent and use hexadecimal. And so to make it black, it's 0, 0, and 0 all the way. And so now let's see. And that looks exactly the same. With the only difference that it's actually 4, 4, 4, but that doesn't really matter. And once again, this element that we just created and styled does exist here kind of in the HTML tree that we can see here in the DevTools. But of course, in our own HTML, it is nowhere to be found here close to this H2, right? So CSS, once we declare it here, will then automatically create it and will put it here so that we can style it. So the styles, of course, then appear down here in the styles panel. And here are the usual values of the box model. Okay, And so this is how we work with pseudo elements in HTML. Now there's also the before, but actually that would look exactly the same way. The difference is that after will basically become the very last child element of the one that we are selecting here, while before will become the very first child element. So if we change this here to before, then you see that here it switched position. But since we are positioning this element in an absolute way, that doesn't matter at all how the result looks like. But since we are positioning this pseudo element in an absolute way anyway, it doesn't change how it looks like, no matter if we use after or before. Nice. So with this, we actually finished this part of the CSS fundamentals. So great job and well done for still being with me here, even as the content is getting a little bit more complex and maybe a little bit harder to understand. But that's just part of the learning journey. And so just make sure that you really understand everything that I show you here by practicing and by always reviewing the code for each lecture. Now, the next two lectures will be about some developer skills that are important for you as you start your journey as a web developer. And then after that, we have one final coding challenge for the section so that you can practice what we just learned over these last couple of videos. So the next few videos are very important and very exciting, I think. And important messages that I want to get across in this course is that you do not have to memorize every single CSS property that there is or that you learn in this course, and also that you can actually start writing your own CSS even when you don't know everything yet. So for beginners like you, it's really important to be aware of the fact that it is okay not to know everything and that you can always Google when you don't know anything or read the documentation. And so in this lecture, I want to quickly show you some techniques that I use to Google stuff that I don't know, and also how to read documentation in order to learn something about a property that you don't know yet or that you don't remember how exactly to use. And let's start with a hypothetical but real-world scenario. So let's imagine that you build a form on your web page and that form has a button. But now you don't remember how you can actually add like that mouse cursor to the button. So when your users hover the button, you want it to look something like this. So with this cursor here happening. But again, you don't remember how to do that. But again, you might not remember how to actually do that. And this is really no problem at all. So you can always Google something if you don't know how to do it and read the documentation as well. So in this case, this is what I would do. So I would Google CSS. And so the first word that I always use when I'm searching something related to CSS is CSS. And then let's say CSS property to add a mouse cursor to button. So this is basically what you want to achieve, right? And then in the search results, usually you want to look for stackoverflow.com. So Stack Overflow is basically a website where millions of users have posted tens or maybe hundreds of millions of questions about all kinds of programming. And that includes CSS. So this W3 Schools is usually not a good reference, so don't use that. Then there's also CSS Tricks, which is also very good. And down here, there is developer.mozilla.org, which is actually the MDN documentation, which we will check out also in a minute. But for now, I'm interested in here is Stack Overflow, which again is like a Q&A site where people can ask questions and then other users help them. So here we have a question, how to change the cursor into a hand when a user hovers over a list item. Now, you are not really interested in the list item, but the rest of the question is kind of what you're looking for, right? So let's try to take a look at our responses here. And here is the most popular one, and which was also voted as correct by the original poster. So here what they do is to basically add cursor set to pointer to the element which should get that hand, right? And in fact, that is actually the solution. So now we can just copy the solution, or if you think that is a bad practice, well, then you can just go to your button and write it manually. But what matters is that now you solved your problem simply by Googling it. All right? So again, don't feel bad for having to Google when you don't know anything. I do that every single day. So really, developers never know everything. We just know that something exists, and we also know how to then look it up. So of course, you need to know the fundamentals about how CSS actually works, but again, you don't need to memorize every single property. You just need to know that it is possible to add a mouse cursor to a button, but you don't have to always know how exactly to do that. Okay, now let's try another example. And returning actually here to our page, let's imagine that we wanted to center all of these links inside of the navigation. So here we have the navigation, and here we have these links. And so we want to center them. So let's try to do that on our own. And the first approach might be to select these anchor elements and set the text align to center. Right? So I'm pretty sure we selected them somewhere. And here they are, actually. And so let's do what I just explained. So let's try text align and set to center. Let's give it a save. Maybe I have to reload manually. Okay, but now you see that nothing changed. So let's inspect this. And well, we need some more space here. All right. And so selecting them, of course, we can see that text align center is indeed set, but still nothing happens. All right. However, if we think about this, this actually makes sense, because what text align does is to basically center some text inside of an element. Now, these elements here are inline elements, and therefore the only space that they occupy is exactly the space that the content needs, right? And so the width of these elements is exactly as wide as it needs to be to fit the content. Therefore, it is not possible to center anything inside of them, because there is simply no empty space inside of which the element could be centered. Okay, so having arrived at that conclusion, maybe now you don't know how to actually solve the problem, because you still want all these links centered here. So let's try to Google that once again. Let's say CSS, how to center anchor elements. Okay, and now again you want to be looking for stackoverflow.com, and this one looks exactly what we are looking for. So how do I center an anchor element in CSS? And many times you actually need to open up various questions, because not always their question is exactly the same as yours. Now, in this case, we actually have the correct solution right here. So what they say is add the text align CSS property to its parent style attribute. Well, this part of the style attribute is not really relevant, because remember I told you not to use style like this, right? But instead using a class, and that is also not really important. What matters is that what we need is this. So we need text align center set to the parent. All right. So let's then put that into our code. And so we want this not here, but we want it in the nav. So let's go look for the nav. It should be somewhere at the top. Here it is. And now text align set to center. And here we go. So now these elements are actually centered inside of the parent container. Okay? And in this case, this works because these elements are inline elements. Or actually, in this case, inline blocks, but what matters is they do not occupy the entire width of the parent. And so when we want to center a bunch of elements like this, no matter if inline or inline block elements, then all we need to do is to add the text align center property on the parent element. Okay? Now maybe you wanted to learn a little bit more about this property. And so let's now use the MDN documentation. Now this is not an official documentation, but it's still what most developers use to look up CSS properties. So we write MDN, then CSS, because on MDN there are many different languages, and then let's say text align. And then here the first result is already what we're looking for. So developer.mozilla.org. And so here there is basically a description and also some demos about different values for this property. So the text align CSS property sets the horizontal alignment of the content inside a block element or table style box. Okay, and so that's exactly what we did. So we set it here, text align center, on a block element, right? And previously we tried to set it on an inline block element, and there it didn't do anything. And so we could also have gotten that here from the documentation. Then here we can click on some different demos. So of course left, right, center, and there is even justify. Then here are all the different values that exist. And then here's a bunch of even more stuff that you probably don't even need. So a lot of more examples. And this one is also important. Well, not in this case, but in some more modern properties, here we can see the browser compatibility of this specific CSS property. So in this case, it's not that relevant, but sometimes you might want to check that out as well. Now another one, for example, we can check for border, because this one is a little bit complex. And so let's say you want to set a border, for example, a dotted one or a wavy border, but you don't remember exactly the syntax. All right. So here you have a couple of examples once again, and you can click them and check them out. And here you can also learn, as I mentioned before, that border is actually a shorthand property for the border width, style, and color. And then here again you have a bunch of examples, and yeah, for all the properties that you want, you can check out the documentation to learn exactly what values you can give them and how they work. Okay, and I think with this I showed you enough so that you can on your own now try to Google some questions that you might have, and also read documentation about some properties that you might not know exactly how they work. And this is a really important developer skill that you need to learn as you start becoming a CSS and also HTML developer. A very important skill that you will need as you become a web developer is to debug your own code and to ask questions in case that you cannot solve certain problems. So in programming, we say that a bug is basically an error or a mistake. And so basically debugging our code means finding and fixing errors in code. All right. And so let's now pretend that there is some error in your code. And in HTML, the most common error, so the most common bug that occurs, is that some elements remain unclosed. So that can easily happen even with VS Code automatically closing elements for us, but still sometimes with copy-paste or with some other things that happen, sometimes we end up deleting these closing tags and then some error might appear. So let's say that for some reason we never closed the strong element here, And then our page is going to look like this. And of course, for this example, we need to pretend that we don't know about this bug, right? Anyway, this doesn't make any sense. So if we just introduce the bug and then we render our page, then all of a sudden our page looks like this, right? And this might be a little bit scary because you look at your page and it looks very wrong. This is not what you intended, right? So how to fix this? Well, in this case, it is actually very simple. All you need to do is to take a look at this result here, so at this page, and actually figure out where the bug started. So the problem here is clearly that all the text is bold where you don't want it to be. And so to debug this code, you need to look where the code is not bold. So up here, for example, the text is not bold. And so the bug must appear somewhere below this. Then this one here is bold, but that's simply because it's an H2. Then here you see some more text that is also not bold. And then from here on, all of a sudden, everything is bold. And so that means that your bug must be somewhere here. And so then you can move back to your HTML and notice that, oh, you did not close this element. And then it's very simple. You just come here, close your element, give it a save, and you're back. And the same can of course happen on all other kinds of elements. So let's say for some reason you overwrote this closing tag here. Then you take a look, and again everything is suddenly bold and also bigger and blue. And so maybe immediately from the color and the bold text, you can see that this now looks like the H3. So again, you can then come to your code, notice that there is a bug, and fix it. Now, one of the bugs that is quite common is that, for example, here you close the LI and leave the content outside. So something like this. And then as you check your page, something looks very off, right? But then again, it is just a matter of going to the place in the HTML that corresponds to this problem and then figure out what happened. So in this case, that's pretty clear. You have an extra closing LI. So just close that and we are back to safety here. Now, what if this happens in like a bigger element? So let's say here in the aside, if we delete this, then the error might not be that apparent. So you see, it's not that apparent. All that happened is that this text here is suddenly inside of this aside element. So now imagine that you created this bug in your code very early on, even before you actually started writing the CSS. And so in that case, you never noticed that this was happening. And then as you started writing the CSS, you suddenly noticed that this is off, but you don't really remember writing the HTML. So you're not sure what might be wrong here. And so a great solution in that case is to actually use an HTML validator tool. So that will basically allow you to see if your HTML is valid or not. So to do that, let's copy all of the code here. At least that I think is the easiest way of doing this. Then here we need to Google HTML validator. And then usually it should be this very first result. But I will also have a link to this HTML validator on my resources page, as I showed you before. So here we can validate by introducing a URI. So that's something like a URL. We can manually upload a file, or we can simply paste the code that we just copied here. And so again, that is, I think, the easiest solution. So let's click on check. And now actually we have a couple of errors. So not just the one that we were looking for, but you see that down here actually is that unclosed element aside. So that is the bug that we just on purpose introduced. So let's fix that here. All right. Then here we have another error, which is end tag div scene, but there were open elements. So this error is actually related to this one, and this is quite common to see in a validator. So that one error in the code actually then creates multiple right here. Okay, so these two were fixed by what we just did here. But then here apparently we have some other errors in our code. So let's actually fix those. So in line 131, we have the duplicate attribute with. So let's fix that. And actually, that's true. So we have with and then with again. And of course, this should be height. So height like this. And then finally, there is yet another one. So in line 137, attribute height not allowed. And actually the problem here is that this is misspelled. So that's a stupid error. So it's not TH, but HT like this. So you see that actually even before on purpose introducing a bug, we had invalid HTML all along. So now I'm copying it again. So then here I will Command or Control A to select everything, delete it, and paste it again. Then check, and now we have no errors or warnings to show. Okay, so that is the HTML validator. So a very useful tool, but let me now actually show you another tool, which is a div checker. And a div checker can be very helpful to compare your own code with my code that I actually code here in the videos. So in case you run into any problem where your page looks different than mine, probably something is wrong in your code. And so in that situation, you can compare your code automatically to mine, basically. So let's say that for some reason, instead of using the A element here, you used link. And link doesn't make any sense here, but well, with anchors, we are actually creating hyperlinks. And so for some reason, you might have made a mistake of, instead of using A, using link, because you might have thought that this is what creates links. And so now somehow your code here is not clickable and it's black instead of blue. And actually, let's go back to our CSS here, and in the nav, remove this piece of code that we added in the last video, right? But anyway, now let's actually compare this code with my code. So with the final code in this section. So let's search for div checker like this. And then you can simply use divchecker.com. So here you will put your code. So again, Command or Control A, then copy, then paste. And now here on this side, you need the other code, or actually the other way around. So here you want the original. So let's delete that. And here your changed text. And so let's now come to the code that you downloaded. So this repository. And then I have the final folder here. And so this is what you can use this code for. So to compare it with your own code. So we are in this section of the CSS fundamentals, and we're interested in the index. And so in order to open this up, we can very simply drag it onto the VS Code icon here in the menu bar. And so this is basically the final code of this section. So again, selecting everything, copying it, then I can paste that here, and then somewhere there should be the Find Different button. So by the time you are watching this video, this interface might look a little bit different, but the basic idea should still be there, that you have two text boxes and then some button to compare them. So just click that, And then you see the differences nicely marked in here. So in the original, of course, we have the A element, while you, for some reason, had the link. Okay, and in this case, that's the only difference. Or actually, here is some other one. So the closing tag, and here is just closing. So let me actually fix that as well. So here, of course, it should be A. Let's put that back. And then here, there's also something wrong in the content. So closing tag, here it should be the closing tag. Let's see if there is something else. But, yeah. Here are these bugs that we just solved also. So previously we had with twice, right? And so we fixed that already. And so here we are good. And this was wrong previously. So in the final file, it was actually still wrong. Okay. But besides that, that's it. Okay. Then down here, we have access again to that text. So we can do some changes here. So let me just introduce a couple more just so we could see how that looks like then. So this li here, let's say we didn't close this somehow. Let's say that here inside of the footer, we actually closed not footer, but header for some reason. Okay, find the difference. And then here you see that it looks very different. So even if you have just empty lines, it will still show up here in the div checker. All right, so that's all the changes that we just introduced. Now, okay, great. So div checker and HTML validators are two extremely helpful tools to debug your HTML code. But now let's go actually to CSS, because there are also some potential bugs that might happen there. Now, one of the most common sources of bugs in CSS are some conflicts between selectors. So let's select these links here once again. And keep in mind that they are inside of the nav, which is inside of the main header. Okay. So we have the nav a link here. But for some reason, let's imagine that we selected these links also somewhere else and then added some different style there. So let's say somewhere here in the middle of the rest of the code. And here we wrote a different selector. So let's say that here we wrote main header, and then inside of that the nav, and then inside of that the A. Like this. And here we set the color actually to red. Okay, but we still want our color to be blue. But now if we reload this, then our text is actually red. So we have two selectors which both define the color and they both apply. And so if before you wrote this and only later you then wrote this piece of code and wanted the text actually to be blue, then you might not be understanding what actually happens here. Well, the color is actually not the perfect example here. So let's play instead with the margin top. So let's say that for some reason you defined the margin top to be 100 pixels for the link, but then a bit later again you write this rule here where you actually only want the margin top to be 10 pixels. So you are writing this rule, then you give it a save, and all of a sudden it looks like this. So you have 100 pixels. So what is happening? Well, let's inspect. And well, you see that both of these selectors apply, of course, so both of the rules, but the margin top that does actually apply is this one here in this longer selector. So as a rule of thumb, besides the rules that we already learned before about selector priority, if one selector is way more complex than the other, then many times it's actually the more complex one that gets applied. Okay, And so that's why I also told you before that you should avoid writing a selector like this. So a very complex one. So keep your selector simple like this one, and that will then avoid creating bugs like this. Okay. Now technically here, if we take a look at the selector specificity, you see that it has 1, 2, right? So memorize that, 0, 1, 2, and here we have 0, 2, 2. And so these numbers are larger, and therefore this is the one that actually gets applied. Now I mentioned before not to worry about specificity because that gets too complex, but basically the higher the numbers, the more that selector will apply. All right. So don't write selectors like this, and instead keep their specificity low. Okay. And if you follow the rules that I showed you about the priority of selectors, then you should be fine. Another common problem that might happen is that for some reason you misspell a property name, and that happens all the time. So let's say that instead of write, you wrote this, then you give it a save, and of course the element is not positioned where you expected it to be. So in that case, the simplest thing to do is simply to inspect that element and then check out what happened there. Now, in the case of a pseudo element like this, you will actually have to then click here to open the element itself, and then from there you can select the pseudo element. And then you can simply check out the properties here, and you will then find this icon here, which means unknown property name. And so from that, you will immediately know that here you misspelled something. So then you come here to your code, fix that, and you're good to go again. So this one is also more common than you thought. And so doing what I just did here is always a good idea. And in general, it is also always a good idea to always experiment with this code that you have here in the DevTools and play around with it and, for example, tweak values here. So instead of, for example, experimenting with the H2 font size here in the code, you can simply come here to this value, click it, and then on your keyboard, you can use the up and down keys, just like it says here, actually, so in that tooltip. So with this, you can see real life how these values changed, and you can also use shift and up and down, and then it will increment in steps of 10. So this is very, very helpful. I do this all the time when I'm experimenting with different values. Okay? And if for some reason you somehow really cannot fix your code, then of course, again, you can use the diff checker to compare your CSS code with the one that I show in the video. So the final code of the section that is in the repository that I just showed you before. Now, finally, one error that I see beginners make all the time is to not correctly link the CSS file in the first place. So remember that that happens up here in this link, and sometimes for some reason students mess up the path to the CSS file. That's also because sometimes we might want to put this into a different folder, so just like we did with the images, and then you need to correctly, of course, write the path in relation to this HTML file. So in case that no CSS at all is applied to your page, then the first thing that you need to check is if this link here is correct. So if your style sheet was correctly linked to your HTML. Okay? So this is how you fix some of the most common bugs in HTML and CSS. But if for some reason you really cannot fix any of the bugs that you found, even using all of the tools that I just showed you in this video, then of course you can ask a question in one of the platforms that I just showed you, and in particular on Stack Overflow, or you can also post a new question here in the Udemy Q&A. Now what matters here is that you always post all of your code to a CodePen first. So instead of copy and paste all your code to Stack Overflow or into the Udemy Q&A, please make it easy for the person who will help you, and instead paste all your code into a CodePen. So we have already used CodePen for the challenges, but just to make sure, well, where is it now? Here. So start coding, or you can just write /pen. And then, again, grab all your code, put it here in the HTML, and then all your CSS right here. And in case you have JavaScript, you can also put it here. Then you save it, for which you will need an account, and then you just copy the URL and paste it either to Stack Overflow or to the Udemy Q&A section. Okay? All right. And I think that's it about the basic skills of debugging and asking questions. So of course, debugging can go a lot deeper than just this, but for now, I just wanted to give you an overview of what debugging is and how it works. And now to wrap up this section, let's continue building our coding challenge that we have been building in the next. I'll come back to the last coding challenge of this section. And as always, we will keep working on our same project. So this is how we left it after coding challenge number 2. And so as always, keep this as a starting point, which hopefully you have on some CodePen or somewhere on your computer. And if not, the link to this code will be in this lecture. And what I want you to do is basically to change this to this. And essentially, there are only 2 big changes. First, we have this sale label here in this top left corner of the element. And then also down here, we have basically these 6 available colors in which we can buy the shoe. So I want you to build this part here and this. So this sale is very similar to something that we did before. So hopefully you remember that's this. Okay. But in this case, you actually don't need to use a pseudo element for that. You can simply add a element, for example, a paragraph for the sale, and then position it here just like we did it in one of the previous lectures. Now, maybe you're noticing this detail that in this text, there is some space between the different characters or these letters here, right? And so there is a CSS property which allows you to do that. And what I want you to do is to Google that. So I want you to use Google to figure out how you can add that space, a little bit like I showed you in the developer skills lecture about Googling. So now you can apply that as well. Okay. So that is one of the things that you need to do. And the other one is this here. So basically what you will need to do is to create an element, and then inside of that element, which can be a simple div. So inside of that element, then you need to create 6 more elements, and these can also be divs if you like. And then all you need to do is to give each of them a color and put them side by side using a neat little trick that we actually also learned in one of the lectures. And in particular, it was the lecture about the types of boxes, if I remember correctly. So this was a nice little trick that we used there. And so you can use that here as well. And if you don't remember it, as always, there is absolutely no problem if you need to go back to our code and look up exactly how we did that. And the same, of course, goes for this technique here. So I don't expect that you memorize all the techniques that I show you here, but if you can look them up in your code and translate them to a different situation, that already would be an amazing achievement. Okay? So if you can just do that, then please go ahead and pause the video now, and I see you once you're done. All right, back to work here, and let's start with the sale label. So as I said, I will simply add a paragraph somewhere, and since we will position it absolutely, it doesn't really matter where it is, but I will just put it here close to the price and the shipping, because semantically that's where it makes sense to be located. So let's give it a class of sale. And then we want the text of sale as well. And then let's close this. And now here in our CSS, let's put it also close to this shipping. So down here. And let's start by adding some visual styles to it. So some background color, for example. And here you could have just used any red color that you wanted. For example, using the VS Code color picker. And I also did that. And so the color I came up with is EC2F2F. Just like this. Let's actually go there. All right. Then let's worry about the text. So let's make it white like this. Give it a font size of 12 pixels and make it uppercase. And make it bold as well. So font weight bold. Let's give it some padding. 7 pixels at the top, 15 left and right. And again, these don't really matter, but many times it's a good idea to have the horizontal padding to be kind of double of vertical. So that's a good rule of thumb that many times looks very good. And now the next step is that actually we want this element only to occupy the space that it actually needs. So there are two techniques for that. Well, actually just one, but you could also kind of achieve this in a different way. So the best way to do this would be to set the display to inline box, actually inline block. And so now indeed, just like any inline element, the box only occupies the space of its content. Okay, so this is the correct solution, but let's comment this out to show you another solution. So you could have also kind of guessed the width of this element if you wanted. Let's say 100 pixels, and then we could adjust it. So let's say just 80 pixels, or just 50 pixels maybe, or 40 even. And then once you kind of got close, you can then just say text, align, center, because now there is actually enough space around the element inside of which the text could then be centered. Okay, so when we have actually a width, then we are no longer in that situation where text align center doesn't make sense in an element like we had before here with these links. Remember that? So I think like 2 lectures ago. But anyway, this is not the preferred solution, but it is something that we could also have done. So I found it interesting to also show you that. And so now it's time to actually absolutely position this element right here. So let's remember that the first thing that we need to do in order to absolutely position an element is to define in relation to what parent element this element should be positioned. And so on that parent element, we set position to relative. So in this case, that should be quite easy, right? That is simply this product here. So this article with the class of product. And so this is where now we want to set position to relative. And so now we can go back here and say position absolute and set the top and left to 0 just to get started. Okay. And now we can kind of guess the values where this should be. So let's say like minus 15 pixels. That can be a little bit more, like 17. Yeah. So now it's like nicely in the middle. And now let's move it also like 30 pixels to the left. So that's not quite centered yet. Let's say 35. Well, let's actually make it 34, so it's exactly double of the top. All right, so with this, we are almost done with this part. All that's missing is this extra space between the characters, right? So to give it this extra touch, and also because I wanted you to practice your Googling skills. So what I would have Googled is CSS add space between characters, or you could have written letters as well. But here you actually immediately get the result. So letter spacing. But I'm more interested in here, usually in a Stack Overflow reply or this documentation of MDN. So here we have letter spacing, which looks like something we want. And so here, indeed, we get, as always, a couple of different examples. And so, yeah, this is the property that we're going to use. So I'm copying it. Let's put it here close to these styles. And I'm setting it to 2 pixels. And yeah, that actually looks a lot nicer. Now we just need to push it even a bit more to the side there, like this, to center it. And yeah, that's it. So we are done with this part. So now let's quickly add those colors here. And as I said previously, we will basically create a div, so a container without any semantic meaning. And then in there, I will create 6 more divs, and then each of them will get its own background color. So that should be right here after the link. Right, so after the link and before these product details. So a div, and I'm calling it the colors. Let's just immediately close it so we don't forget it, because this editor is not as good as VS Code, but it's still quite helpful to actually use CodePen for something like this. And now we will just create another div in here, color. And then actually this doesn't have any content at all. All right. So this is something we didn't really do before. And so let me just explain and show you how we will do it. So we want 6 colors, so I'm just copy pasting it 6 times. So yeah, let's put that right here at the end. So just like in the HTML. So the colors class is not really important, I think. So let's just start by defining each of the squares. So each of these. So basically we make them a square by giving them a certain height and then a width, which is the same. So let me show that to you. The first thing we should do is to give them a background color to make it easier to see it. The first one I think was black. All right, but right now they are not visible because they don't have any content. But if we give them a height and a width, then they will become visible. So let's do that. Height, 22 pixels. And so now immediately they got a height, and then they occupy all the space that they can because they are block level elements by default, right? So they are divs, and therefore that is by default a block level. But now if we specify their width to be the same, so it looks like a square, then, well, then of course, they no longer do that. Okay, so of course we are still far away from the final result, but in order to continue effectively, let's now give each of them a different color. So how can we do that? Well, I will actually add another class to each of them, and that is completely possible. Remember that we are allowed to give each element more than one class. So I showed you that before. So the way we do that is to add a space and then simply add another one. So the first one was black. then blue, red, yellow, green, and brown. And so, well, in the first one, we actually don't need to do that because they are black already, all of them. And so we can then basically override that in all the other ones. So let's call this one the color blue. And then let me just copy paste that a couple of times. So red, yellow, green, and brown. And now we will of course have to select all of them right here. So again, you could have come up with any blue color that you'd like. My choice was this one, 2F6EE2. So let's see. And indeed, now it is blue. I will just copy this a couple of times. Okay. So red, yellow, green, and brown. So not here, but here. Here, let's use the same red that I had before. Actually. And then the yellow was F0BF1E. Green is 90CC20. And finally, the brown is 885214. And there you go. There we have our 6 different colors. Now all we need to do is to put them side by side. So how can we do that? Well, there is a neat trick that we learned before, which is to change the display property of these elements to inline block. So we will now set all of these 6 elements, so all of them which have the class of color, to inline block, because like this they will only occupy the space that they need, and they will also not create any line breaks after them. And so that is exactly what we want. Now we could not use inline because then the height and width wouldn't really work as expected, or at least they shouldn't. And you see that indeed it doesn't work. So it needs to be inline block because remember, height and width do not apply to inline elements. And now all we need is a small margin to the right of each of them of, let's say, 12 pixels. And there we go. It's a bit too much maybe. So 10 pixels. And that's it. So that's all we need to do. Well, actually we are missing like some space here after this anchor. And remember how we actually already had this problem before. So we tried to add some space, so some margin bottom to this anchor, but it didn't work. And so the workaround was to then add that space at the top of this heading. Remember that? So that's why here this details title has the margin top. And by the time we didn't understand why adding margin bottom to this anchor element didn't work. But now we actually do. So let's do that as well. So that's right here. So let's add a margin bottom here of 30 pixels, which will still not work. But again, we now know why it doesn't work. And the reason is that the anchor element is an inline element. And on inline elements, the top and margin bottoms do not apply. So to fix that, once again, we need to display this as an inline block. So easy enough, display inline block, and there you go. There we have our 30 pixels now nicely displayed. Okay, and I think with this, our solution looks exactly the same as our demo. So we are done. now as it looks. Yep, so seems so. And so, yeah, that actually wraps up this introduction to CSS section. So one more time, congratulations for reaching this first part of the course. And you now have all the fundamentals of HTML and CSS that you need in order to start building layouts, which is actually one of the main parts of CSS. So there's a whole section waiting about that. And so once you're done reviewing everything that we did here, I will see you in that next section once